Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Casino Kid, brought to us by Sofel. Casino Kid is, of course, a casino-based game featuring poker and blackjack. In Casino Kid, you are taking the role of an up-and-coming casino enthusiast who must take on 16 experts, 8 in blackjack and 8 in poker. After completing the matches against all 16 of them, you then get to face off with the Casino King in order to reign supreme as the true king of the casino. When you start the game, you can either start a brand new game or put in a password to pick up wherever you may leave off. After completing each of the opponents, you can get a new password if you would like, so that you can then re-enter it and continue your game. Basically, the game is broken up into one big casino map, and like I mentioned before, there are 16 competitors for you to face off with. Your goal is to find the locations of them, and you have to complete each of the poker and each of the blackjack ones in a certain order. So we're going to work our way to the very bottom of the casino to take on Lisa, the first of the blackjack players. You then face off against the competitor in a series of blackjack hands. Basically, your goal, of course, is to try to take all of their money the best way that you can by doing hands of blackjack or poker. Now, the rules of blackjack, of course, are quite simple. Your goal is to get to either 21, or at least have closer to 21 than your opponent without going over. Of course, all the cards are your base value, with the face cards being worth 10 apiece, and the aces being worth either 1 or 11. At the beginning of each hand, you must put down the minimum bet, and the minimum bet depends on who you're currently playing. For example, on this table, the minimum bet we can put down is 100, though you can put less than that. Of course, if you're going to want to speed things along and actually get through the game anytime this century, you're going to definitely want to bet max on every hand possible. Once the cards are dealt out, you start off with 2 cards. Of course, you can see your 2 cards, and you can see one of the cards of your opponent. You'll then be able to either hit, which means another card will be placed on yours. You can stay where you currently are, and hope your opponent doesn't get closer to 21 than you are. You can do the double down, which is the best thing you can do in the game, and I do it as much as I possibly can. Basically, what that does is it doubles your bet for the next card you place down. Especially later on, when I face the harder opponents, if I have 14 or less, I pretty much do the double bet every single time. Of course, if you end up losing the hand, then at that point, you do lose double the money. The other thing you can do is split. Basically, if you have like 2 8s or 2 of the same card, you can then split it and do 2 different hands of blackjack against your opponent. Of course, you then have to win both hands in order to get the benefit out of it, so it's a little bit more risky than doing the double bet, but I do that often as well. But the opportunities to do that aren't nearly as plentiful, of course, as doing the double bet. Once you take all the money from the opponent, they are defeated, and then you get to move around the casino once again. Next up, though, we're going to go over to the other game you can play in Casino Kid, and that is poker, and start off with Joseph. Like I said, you have to complete them in a certain order, so even though we have some of the tougher opponents that we'll have to deal with later, you can't go straight to the toughest opponents, beat them early, and then do the easier ones after that. You have to go in order for each, the poker and the blackjack, though the order for this I don't think matters. For example, you can do all the blackjack opponents and then all of the poker opponents if you really want to. However, I always like to mix it up, so I've never really tried that out. Now, poker is a lot harder to explain. I will kind of go with the assumptions that a lot of you guys are going to know how to play basic poker. Your goal in each hand of poker is you get dealt 5 cards. You can then choose to kind of bet on that, raise the pot a little bit and see if your opponent wants to match you depending upon what you have. And then you can decide to pick and choose a few cards from your 5 cards to hold. And then the other cards you don't hold will then be replaced, and whoever has the best hand will then win. If I were to kind of explain every nuance and every type of hand in poker, I'd probably be here all day. Plus, I'm not an exact expert, so I would end up messing stuff up and end up just getting a lot of angry comments. However, what I will do is kind of explain some of the basic rules of poker for this particular game, what you should and pretty much shouldn't do. One thing that's nice about poker, and I do find poker a lot more fun to play in Casino Kid than Blackjack. Blackjack drags on forever, even though I am a fan of actually playing Casino Blackjack. There are a few clues in order to help you out while playing poker, mostly the facial expressions and the things the characters say right before they end up betting or right after they get their hand dealt to them. Usually it's something dumb like "it's fun," which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you can kind of look at the character and kind of, as long as they're not really overly enthusiastic about what they're getting, they're usually pretty easy to deal with, especially the earlier opponents. Very rarely do you see them get something like a full house or a flush of any kind. You're usually going to be dealing with one or maybe two pairs at most during your early poker opponents. Heck, even late in the game, I found a lot of times the most I had to beat was 2 pair. What helps poker go so much quicker than blackjack is because you have multiple betting periods. For example, you already have to put 10 down on the table to get your hand dealt to you in this match, and the ante does increase as you go on. But then you have to bet initially, and then you can bet again after the final holding of your hand until you finally reveal it. So you get multiple betting periods, which allows poker to go a lot more quickly than the blackjack game. If you're already good at poker, you'll have absolutely no problem whatsoever kicking the crap out of the opponents in this game. Honestly, the only thing that's really tricky about playing Casino Kid, as long as you have a little bit of knowledge of these games, is the blackjack, because the blackjack is a lot more random and a lot more hard to try to get better hands and try to actually beat your opponent. At the end of a matchup against an opponent in poker, if you see they have less than the max bet that you currently can give out, go ahead and just always do the max bet, even if your hand is garbage, because that will automatically allow you to win, because they won't be able to match your bet, and the match will end. After completing our first poker opponent, it's time to move on to our next blackjack opponent, and unfortunately sometimes the characters walking around the casino can get in your way. And usually the characters that are moving around the casino really don't give you much useful information. Some of them do give you a bit of hints about upcoming opponents, but it's usually something like, you can't read that guy's face, which really isn't that helpful overall. The hardest thing, honestly, about Casino Kid is trying to sometimes find the next opponent that you're meant to be facing off with. Thankfully, every time you play, the opponents are always in those same locations. The blackjack opponents are always at the tables, and the poker opponents, though, you have to kind of search a little bit more for than those blackjack players. As you make it farther and farther with each of the opponents, the amount of money that you have to gamble for each hand minimally increases, but also the amount total that you can bet does increase, so it helps matches go a bit quicker. I really wish you could just bet a lot more. Like, for example, even on the early matches in blackjack, just let me bet up to like 500 per hand. Let's get the game moving a little bit. While it is, I'm sure, fun for a bit for a lot of people, once you try to sit down and play all the opponents in a row in one sitting, it really starts to drag. Unfortunately, with it being a card game, and it being, of course, completely random, every hand that you end up getting dealt, there's really not a whole lot of strategy that I can really give, other than some basic pointers. Like I mentioned in Blackjack, always double bet as maximum as you possibly can. I also recommend getting the password, or looking up the password, before every blackjack opponent. The poker ones are a lot more easy, and I usually never have problems being able to complete a poker opponent. However, the blackjack opponents sometimes can get way far ahead, and it just takes so long without you being able to kind of like dwindle their money down. In fact, one way I can say enjoying the game, especially on some of the later blackjack opponents, you may just want to use a password and skip some of them, just so you can do more of the fun poker matches. Of course, I'm not also going to bore you guys with a ton of the actual hands that I played through, and the way I'm going to do this is I'll show you the locations, I'll show you the beginning of each of the matches, and then I'm just going to kind of fast forward ahead so we can kind of speed things up, show you the locations of each of the opponents, so that's pretty much one of the toughest things about the game, and of course show you the final boss and ending. After completing our next matchup against Martha, we're going to go to our next poker opponent, who is known as Steven, and he's located on the other side of the casino map. Work our way up here and inside this row of slot machines, which unfortunately you can't play the slot machines in the game. But here we go with our next poker opponent. While he does have $2,000 to start with, thankfully you can bet maximum of $200, and this really will help you speed along your match against Steven. As far as my strategies go in poker, basically, of course, if I have my hand and I have anything that matches, of course I'm going to save those cards. However, if you have the thing where you have none of the same exact card, best bet is, of course, to save the highest cards that you have. So you have like an ace, save that one and nothing else, and hope for the best when you end up getting your redealt hand. You may also notice that if you have no really high cards, like no face cards or even a 10, but you have a lot of lower cards that are all of the same suit, keep those and then hope, of course, you get the same suit in return for the ones that you get rid of. That way, of course, you can at least minimally get a flush. Just like with Blackjack, it's going to be random what hands you end up getting dealt, so there really isn't a definitive strategy. You can kind of look for patterns. Like I said, of course, if you notice you already have something brewing or have like a pair of any kind, of course keep that pair. And right here, I have a king, a queen, and an ace. Now, I'm going to end up saving all three of them on this hand, but you may want to only save maybe the ace and king, or just the ace sometimes. This way, you have a lot more opportunities to possibly match up the ace. Now, as far as I know, you also are only being dealt one deck of cards, and once that deck runs out, it then gets reshuffled. So you could technically notice that, like, if you've already seen 3 aces and you have an ace in your hand, you know that no other ace is going to pop up at that moment. But that's really micromanaging, and honestly, really isn't necessary by any means. You should be able to easily win against your poker opponents, as long as you have, like, the basics of poker down. After the matchup with Steven, it's time to move back on to Blackjack. Unfortunately, when you complete a poker opponent, you end up in the poker area of the map, which does, of course, make sense, but because of that, we have to kind of, like, travel back to wherever we want to go. And we're traveling to the upper right corner now in order to face off against Tom, who has a starting pot of 2,000, and unfortunately, we can only bet 100 per Blackjack hand, so it takes a while, and this is when the things start to increase, and also when Blackjack starts to become more of a bore as we go through. One other thing about Blackjack that I haven't really talked about is that there is insurance. Basically, if your opponent looks like they have Blackjack, their face down card, and they have an ace to start off a hand, the game may ask you if you want to take insurance. It's a way that if they do have Blackjack and you take the insurance, you don't lose as much money, but it's still also a gamble, because if you take the insurance and they didn't have Blackjack, they end up getting a free hand basically out of it. Just another little minor thing with Blackjack. Like I said, the only way to kind of make the game go any quicker is by doing a lot of doubles, double downs when you can. You don't want to do a double down usually if you have like a 16 or above. You definitely don't. And usually, like I said, if you have a 14, take the double down. More than likely, you're gonna have a good opportunity. And also, don't be afraid to like stay. If you have like a 15, stand on the 15. There's a lot of times in the game where I stand at a 15 and the opponent ends up busting on their hand. So, like, if you're like, I don't know if I want to just stand on the 15, I win a lot of hands. I mean, I even did an experiment where I sped up the game. I kept hitting the button on turbo and just saw how long, and I did a couple of times of this, and like 3 out of 5 times I ended up eventually beating my opponent by just standing on every single hand, no matter what I ended up getting, which is kind of dumb, but it can be done. But then there's also the thing that's a chance you take, because I did lose a few times as well. And then I had one time where like the opponent ended up going so much money on me that there was like, I would have had to be playing the Blackjack for about another 4 hours if I wanted to dwindle him back down after how bad I was getting my butt kicked by him. So unfortunately, there's really no way to speed it up. After completing our matchup against Tom in the upper right, it's time to move on to our next poker player. Thankfully, he's located really just right near where Tom was, just by these slot machines usually. And here is Ted, who ends up having a $30 ante per hand, and we can bet a little bit more on him, though he does have 3,000 money in order to start off with. Thankfully, we can bet all the way up to 300. $600 on all bets. So this will really help this matchup go pretty quickly. Also, at this point, we've started to get used to the whole kind of play mechanics, how poker and blackjack work, kind of how the game does things, as well as the blackjack opponents, while they increase in difficulty, and really feels like they get a lot of really amazing luck as you go farther into the game. I mean, it's almost obnoxious how ridiculous the blackjack player's luck goes, and why it really becomes frustrating later on. However, the poker matches seem to stay enjoyable, and I usually don't run into issues even as their supposed difficulty gets higher. I know, I'm kind of repeating a few things as we go through, so I'm going to kind of just make the next few matches go by really quickly as we progress through, as there really isn't a whole ton to talk about as far as gameplay and strategy go as we go farther. Pretty much bet max all the time. After facing off with Ted and finally completing him, time to move on to our next opponent, which is going to be once again on the blackjack side of things, as we're going to go face off with Harry. Harry is clearly a reference to Dirty Harry, as it even goes like "make my day" when you start up there, so there's something little interesting Easter egg, I guess, technically, with this character, which I'm sure he's not called Harry in the original Japanese release of the game. Thankfully, this game of blackjack is actually one of the better ones, because even though it is blackjack, you can bet 1,000, and he only starts off with 8,000, so it won't take you too many hands in order to take down the money of Harry and move on to the next opponent. Now, once Harry's done, instead of going to another poker opponent, we're going to stay on the blackjack kick and try to get a couple of the blackjack opponents in a row taken care of. Like I said, you can do these in pretty much any order. As long as you're doing the poker opponents in the same order and the blackjack opponents in the same order, you can kind of mix it up. But this way, I can take care of another blackjack opponent. This one is the same deal. Stephanie has 12,000 to start off with, but once again, you can thankfully bet 1,000. So if you're really, really good, you can complete it in only 6 or 12 turns. But of course, it's not going to be that simple for you to get through it. On my final hand with Stephanie, I was able to get a blackjack and complete her, and now we're going to move on to a poker opponent again, so we can have a little bit more fun. Work our way up to the middle section here, and we want to talk to this person kind of walking around near the slot machines, who ended up blocking us earlier on in the game. This is Lloyd. Now, Lloyd has 12,000, and we can bet 1,000 per bet, so you can get like a total of a couple thousand per hand if you're able to do well with it. One thing I did want to talk about briefly, though, is the company that made the game, Sofel. They only made a handful of games in total throughout their history. They only made a couple ones on the NES, and they made a few SNES games as well. Sofel, though, besides making Casino Kid and its sequel, Casino Kid 2, which I think plays a little bit more fast-paced than the original Casino Kid, however, they also made a game that I feel is a little bit underrated in Wall Street Kid, which actually was the second game in the Wall Street Kid series, or in Japan it's known as the Money Game. They also, though, the one game that I think should definitely be played by and can be appreciated by a lot more people is a game called Dragon Fighter. It was released a little bit later in the NES life, and because of that, it can be a little bit tricky to get a hold of, and the retro prices for it are skyrocketing. But if you can get a hold of Dragon Fighter, it's an awesome action platform game with some really cool abilities that I think people should check out, and it has a good soundtrack as well. Thankfully, with our increased bets, I'm able to get through Lloyd pretty quickly, and after completing the matchup with Lloyd, we're going to do another poker matchup right away. And in order to get to Whitney, our next poker opponent, we're going to be going to the lower left corner of the map. There's a little bar area, and you will find her located there. Now, to match up with Whitney, she does have 18,000, but you can bet $2,000 per bet, so you can take like up to $4,000 of her money per hand, so you'll be able to pretty quickly get through her savings. Once we have completed the matchup with Whitney, time to move from the poker area and go find our next victim, who thankfully is actually right in the same area as the poker tables. Here is Jack. Now, Jack is a big increase in money. As you can see, he has $70,000 to start off with. But the big thing is you have a huge increase in your money that you can bet as well. You can bet $5,000 per time. So, yes, while even though he has a lot more money, the amount that you can bet is so high that you can take $10,000 of his money per hand if you're good. It won't take you too long before you're able to drain the rest of his money and move on to our next opponent. Now, unfortunately, it's time to move back to a Blackjack opponent, and this, of course, will take a little bit of time, especially also when the AI likes to stand directly in front of the table that we're trying to get to. Next up is Clyde, and Clyde, you can only bet 1,000 per bet, and he has 50,000 to deal with. This is where the game really starts to drag, and I am not kidding. I mean, it's going to take you a long time in order to finally dwindle down all the money of Clyde. And since he's a later opponent, he also has seemingly luck out his butt when it comes to dealing with him. After what seems like forever, we finally complete our matchup with Clyde, and we're going to move on right away to another Blackjack opponent. And here's a big difference. Bo, our next Blackjack opponent, does have $70,000 to deal with. However, you can actually bet $10,000 per hand, unlike Clyde, who you could only bet $1,000 against. So, this matchup will take 1/8 of the amount of time it's going to take in order to complete, unlike the matchup with Clyde. After a pretty short matchup with Bo, it's time to move on to another poker opponent. Our next poker opponent, we're going to head over to the right side and talk to this person here in order to enter into the next match. Pam has $100,000 to start off with. The good news, though, is you can bet $10,000 per bet, so it won't take long for you to get through her bank account. Also, if you were able to suffer through and actually complete the matchup against Clyde, you can sit back and actually kind of enjoy yourself a little bit more with this matchup against Pam. We now have only one more poker opponent and one more Blackjack opponent to deal with. Let's have a little bit of fun though first and take on the next of the poker opponents first. In order to locate Cindy, our next poker opponent, we're going to go to the upper left corner of the map, not too far from where we started off the game, and usually she's wandering right around here. Our next opponent, Cindy, has $400,000 at her disposal, and it costs $5,000 per hand just to be able to be in the game. The good thing is, though, you can bet $50,000 per bet, so a total of $100,000 if you're really good. So the final poker matchup will only take a matter of minutes for you to get through. As long as you're able to win just a few hands, Cindy will be able to go down easily. After the matchup with Cindy, we now have only one more opponent to go through in order to face off with the Casino King himself, and that is Bruno, the final of the Blackjack players. Head north from the poker area, and right here pretty much in the center of the casino in his own little unique area surrounded by trees, it is Bruno. Now, Bruno starts off with $250,000, and you can thankfully bet up to $10,000 per hand. But it's definitely going to take a while to slowly dwindle down his money, though it seems to take less time with him than it did against Clyde earlier on, so Bruno's not quite as bad as him. The luck here, though, for Bruno is ridiculous. He seems to get blackjacks a ton, so you have to be very cautious. And like I've always said, if you can do the double bet, the double down, take that chance, because it usually ends up paying off. After finally defeating Bruno, it's time to move on to the final boss. You're instantly taken away to the giant Casino King's mansion in order to face off one-on-one with him in one last game. Thankfully, the final matchup of the game is not in blackjack, but in poker. The Casino King has $1 million at his disposal to face off with you. And thankfully, though, you can bet $100,000 per bet, which is unreal to think about. But thankfully, because of this, you can actually make it through the Casino King battle a lot quicker than some of the earlier matchups against some of the other opponents. Your strategies for poker at this point should be solidified. You've gone through plenty of other opponents, and you've pretty much seen everything the game can throw at you as far as some of the luck and all. And while he is, of course, the final opponent, and you think he's going to have the best luck of all, and he probably does, it doesn't really seem to sometimes be much more than what you have. For example, I was able to get a flush pretty easily in the early goings of this particular matchup. One thing, though, that is annoying about the game, and one reason why you may actually want to save Cindy for last instead of Bruno like I did, is because if you end up losing this matchup, you have to actually face off with the final opponent in the casino again. You can't just instantly put in a code to go right to the final boss. And even though I don't have much here, I only have a pair of 9s, thankfully he only has a high card to present with, and I'm able to easily wing my next hand against him. Now on this final hand of the game, thankfully, because of the way the money works, and like I told you earlier, that if you bet maximum more than what they can possibly bet, you'll instantly win. So here, even though I only have a pair of 5s, and I save the 5s and the jack, I end up only with a pair of 5s in the end, which really isn't that great of a hand. But because he only has a little bit more money to play with, as long as I bet more than what he currently has, I end up winning, and I can sit back and enjoy the ending to Casino Kid. So there you have Casino Kid for the NES. It is overall my personal favorite casino-based game on the original Nintendo, and having this game as a kid is actually what got me into playing poker and blackjack at a relatively early age. And even though I do love this game, the very, very slow-paced blackjack matches, especially the one in particular against Clyde, really brings the game down, and it's one of those ones I recommend playing in small doses. Playing an opponent or two, get your password, and then come back to the game. Trying to sit down and play the entire game in one sitting can really take a long time and really kind of just drain your patience. By now, though, there are tons and tons of better playing casino-based games, and in fact, the best way, of course, is to go to a casino and actually play these games or get a group of friends together and play a game of poker. However, this game does have some pretty good music. The music that is there, I like the anime art style, of course. And the fact that it was actually a little bit of a story, that whole kind of like moving around the casino kind of reminded me of early NES RPGs. Now, while I loved this game growing up, I unfortunately never got to play the sequel until years later, and the sequel came out pretty late in the NES library and is a little bit hard to get a hold of. However, it did add roulette to the mix besides just blackjack and poker, and you only have a total of 9 opponents before making it to the end. So while the game is immensely shorter overall, I think it flows better and allows you to get in and get out of the game a lot quicker than the original here. At the end of the credits, you get the Created by Sofel screen, and I have to say, I love the trophy, and if there was a way to get a trophy similar to that in my house, I definitely would love to have that on display. But with that, that's going to wrap up this edition of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.